ventilation, which may include inadequate recruitment of the lungs or endotracheal tube factors. There can be associated pulmonary vascular resistance issue or hemoglobin, which can be low, etc. And we should never be, using FiO2 of more than 60% without analyzing why this is required. Respiratory rate typically will be 20 to 70 breaths per minute. Although usually in a term baby, the respiratory rate that we use is around 40, and in a preterm baby, the respiratory rate that we use is slightly higher at around 60. Eye time, typically for a term baby, the eye time that we need would be 0.4 or 0.45, and for a preterm baby, we may prefer to use a shorter eye time, which is 0.35 to 0.4. And flow should be in align with the minute ventilation of the baby. At least trying to use 5 times of the minute ventilation of the baby is recommended. So again, for a term baby, the flow that we might require would be around 7-8 liters per minute, whereas for a preterm baby, we may want to use a lesser flow. 4 or 5 liters per minute would be generally sufficient. So,
sorry to interrupt. Slides are not moving from the beginning.
Okay. Are we not on the second slide now? Okay, let me try to share the screen again. Please confirm if you can see the slide on the ranges of different.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so now we will be discussing each of these parameters in detail. So before we go into them, whenever we begin ventilation, one needs to remember that 4 of these 6 players can be generally preset based knowing the clinical condition of the baby, that is knowing the underlying disease. These are PEEP, eye time, respiratory rate, and flow. The 2 parameters that need to be adjusted based on the severity of the disease are PIP and FiO2. So, for example, if we know that we are ventilating a baby with normal lungs, for example, a newborn with apnea, a newborn with shock, or a CNS problem with decreased respiratory drive, we can fairly decide that upfront that this baby having normal lung would probably be okay with a PEEP of 4 or maybe 5. The eye time would be, again, as we discussed, for a term baby, 0.40 seconds, because this baby's time constant is going to be normal. For a preterm baby, around 0.35 seconds. Respiratory rate will be close to the natural frequency of the baby. Of course, when we are ventilating the baby for apnea, we also should not take over the ventilation. We should not be doing overdrive ventilation. So we keep the respiratory rate slightly lower than the natural frequency. So you may begin 25 or 30 breaths per minute for a term baby, or 30 to 40 breaths for a preterm baby, in order to encourage the baby also to spontaneously breathe. And likewise, the flow is determined by the baby's size. So at least 5 times of the minute ventilation. And minute ventilation itself is respiratory rate into the tidal volume. So if we know that we are ventilating a baby with birth weight of 3 kgs with meconium aspiration syndrome, the tidal volume will be around 5 ml per kg, which is 15 ml. And assuming the baby is having a respiratory rate of 60 into 15 ml, this comes to 900 ml. So close to 1 liter. So 5 times of the minute ventilation will be 5 liters per minute. So the minimum flow that we'll be needing is 5 liters per minute. And we have to account for the circuit leak and losses. So another 2 to 3 liters per minute. So a flow of around 7-8 liters per minute would be optimal for a term baby with meconium aspiration syndrome. Whereas for a preterm newborn with RTS, the flow required would be much lesser. So these 4 parameters can be pre-decided based on the underlying condition, clinical status of the baby and the disease that we are dealing with. Whereas 2 parameters that need to be adjusted based on the severity of the disease would be the PIP and FiO2. So a preterm newborn with RTS may require a PIP of 18 if the lungs are moderately abnormal. Same baby, if the baby becomes much more worse and the clinical condition deteriorates, the parenchymal changes are much worse, we may need a PIP of 20 to 22 or even 24 centimeters of water. So this cannot be predetermined based on the disease, but it has to be fine-tuned based on the severity of the baby's clinical condition. Likewise, FiO2. So when we are assessing the adequacy of ventilation, each of these parameters needs to be assessed based on some clinical and some biochemical and some radiological parameters. So simplest is FiO2. FiO2 is titrated based on the saturation, which is targeted, as you all know, 91 to 95%. So if the saturations are below 90%, then we will need to think of increasing either MAP or FiO2. Saturations are above 95-96%, especially in a preterm newborn, we will try to titrate or taper down the FiO2. Intermittently, we will be looking at PaO2, and PaO2 in a term newborn should be at around 60 to 80 millimeters of mercury, whereas in a preterm newborn, we target 50 to 70 millimeters mercury. Likewise, when you take PIP, the PIP, adequacy of PIP is decided based on chest rise clinically. So whenever the baby is getting ventilated, there should be perceptible chest rise, which must be clearly visible when you are by the bedside of the baby. It should not be seen when we are standing very far from the baby, which means the chest is jumping excessively, which is also undesirable. Likewise, the chest rise should not be invisible or should not be something which is undetectable also. That might mean the PIP is less. And when you have the flow sensor, you can also measure the tidal volume, and we want the tidal volume to be 4 to 6 ml per kg in a ventilated baby. And intermittently, we will be assessing the PaCO2 in the blood gas. So these three parameters, clinically the chest rise, the bilateral breath sounds, and in the ventilator graphics, that tidal volume, which must be 4 to 6 ml per kg, and PaCO2 in the blood gas. These three indicate the adequacy of PIP. When it comes to the other four parameters, PEEP is assessed clinically based on the presence of the retractions, recessions. So adequate PEEP, the baby should have no or minimal recessions, and adequate chest expansion, which is measured by the presence of 6 to 8 posterior intercostal spaces on the chest X-ray, and the presence of adequate oxygenation with least FiO2. The presence of the adequacy of respiratory rate is generally indicated by the synchrony of the baby. So if the baby is well synchronized, then we are delivering the right respiratory rate. If the baby is asynchronous and breathing too fast, then we may have to increase the respiratory rate. Or if the baby is requiring very high pressure, then again it might call for a proportionate increase in the respiratory rate. Flow is usually indicated by looking at the adequate delivery of pressure itself. So if you are not providing adequate flow, then the baby may not be able to reach the PIP that we intend to deliver. Likewise, when we discuss I time, we try to see what is the time constant the baby is likely to have, and we know the time constant is a product of compliance and resistance. So if the baby has HMD or a condition where compliance is less, the time constant is also going to be short. Hence, the baby requires a shorter I time, like 0.35 seconds in HMD. Whereas in a baby with increased resistance, like bronchopulmonary dysplasia or a chronically ventilated baby or a baby with meconium aspiration syndrome, the time constant will be longer, and hence the I time that we need to keep should be at least 3 times of the time constant of the baby, which will be around 0.45 seconds or sometimes even longer. So let us discuss PEEP, which is the most important determinant of the FRC or the end expiratory lung volume. FRC is a very important parameter for us because we know that in newborn babies, because of the inherent surfactant deficiency, they may have a compromised FRC, particularly a preterm baby with RTS. So there cannot be one PEEP across all ventilated babies. In a baby with inherently low FRC condition like HMD, we need to begin with a higher PEEP. Whereas in a baby with normal lung, we may begin with a PEEP which is around 4 or 5. Very rarely in a baby with excessive air trapping, you may even consider having a PEEP of 4 or less than 4. Say sometimes you can keep even 3.5 in some ventilators, but this is very, very rarely required. So in meconium aspiration syndrome with air trapping, if you are using conventional ventilation, you may think of keeping the PEEP at the bare minimum. Problems of having a very low PEEP are that there can be decreased functional residual capacity or impaired recruitment of the lungs, leading to poor oxygenation. And this itself will impair the lung mechanics and result in increased pulmonary vascular resistance. Whereas a excessive PEEP can also lead to over distension of the lung and hypercarbia and decreased venous return. So we discussed this, how to begin the PEEP. You assess this based on the underlying lung disease. So usually you will know why you are ventilating the baby for. So if the baby's lungs are normal, we begin with a PEEP of 4. If the FRC of the baby is moderately reduced, like mild to moderate HMD 4 to 5, severe HMD and severely reduced FRC, then we begin with a higher PEEP, at least 5, maybe 6 or 7 in a ventilated baby. Now, eye time, the choices are quite narrow. The choice is between 0.3 to 0.5 seconds. So again, if the baby has a normal lung, then the baby should have normal complaints, normal resistance, and hence normal time constant. So the eye time can be generally set at 0.4 seconds. Whereas if the baby has less complaints, then you begin with a short eye time of 0.3 to 0.4 seconds. In a baby with increased resistance, then we begin with a longer eye time of 0.5 seconds. Setting respiratory rate depends upon the baby's work of breathing and the presence or absence of asynchrony. If the baby is having significantly increased work of breathing, like in a baby who is already breathing fast with hyaline membrane disease, increased work of breathing, reduced functional residual capacity, the baby is having recessions and some asynchrony, it is better that we give the baby a relatively higher respiratory rate. Typically preterm RDS, we may want to start with rate of 55 or 60 breaths per minute. Whereas in a term baby with asphyxia, where the baby is hardly breathing or hardly having a work of breathing, you are primarily ventilating the baby for poor respiratory drive, then we may begin with a respiratory rate of maybe 30 or 40 breaths per minute. Now, in a baby with, who is begin with a short eye time versus a longer eye time, the effect on ventilation itself may be the fact that there may be ineffective delivery of the pressure, resulting in slightly lesser tidal volumes that are generated. Whereas if you give adequate eye time, we are going to be able to deliver the peak pressure that is intended and hence achieve the tidal volume that is of interest. So as you can see here, short eye time can result in inadequate delivery of tidal volume. And when we give the optimal eye time, we see that after the baby has complete chest rise or when the chest is maximally inflated, it remains there for a plateau phase before it drops down. Whereas if we have excessive eye time, then this may result in a prolonged inspiratory hold and ineffective ventilation or asynchrony also. So we need to actually figure out where exactly is the optimal eye time, where there will be a short period of plateau after the baby has achieved complete chest rise. Likewise, if the expiratory time is compromised, we all know that there can be gas trapping. The optimal E time allows the baby to exhale completely and to not have gas trapping. So short E time can result in the generation of auto PEEP or inadvertent PEEP, which is particularly a problem in conditions like meconium aspiration syndrome, where the expiratory time constant is particularly prolonged and the baby needs to be given adequate E time. And we generally target a IE ratio of 1:2.5 or so in order to reach the optimal ratio between inspiration and expiration. So a typical respiratory cycle, which is a sum total of I time and E time, is represented in this manner. When we know any of the parameters, these 4 parameters, respiratory rate, I time, E time, and IE ratio, if we know 2 of them, we can automatically calculate the other 2. So in most ventilators, you only need to set any 2 of these 4 parameters. In some ventilators, like for example, Draeger baby log, you may have to set I time and E time. The respiratory rate will be automatically calculated. And how is that? We know that I time plus E time is 1 respiratory cycle. So for example, if I time is 0.4 second and E time is 0.6 and respiratory cycle is 1 second long, then the total respiratory rate will be 60 seconds divided by 1 second. So which will be 60 breaths per minute. Likewise, if we know the respiratory rate and I time, like we set in SLE 6000 or SLE 5000 ventilator, automatically you know what is the E time, because you know what is the total time for 1 respiratory cycle. So that minus I time will give us the E time. Automatically we will calculate the I to E ratio. TI to TE ratio can be calculated. So among these 4 variables, respiratory rate, I time, E time, and IE ratio, we only need to set 2 of the 4. So these are some examples. So if you know that respiratory rate is 80 per minute and I time is 0.35. So we know that 1 respiratory cycle will be 60 seconds divided by 80 breaths, which is 0.75 seconds. So what is the E time? E time will be 0.75 minus 0.35 seconds, which is 0.4 seconds. So I to E ratio will be 0.35 to 0.4 seconds. So likewise, we can calculate the other two variables when we know two of them. Now moving to the variable flow. Flow is determined by the 5 times of the minute ventilation. So when we talk about minute ventilation, this is tidal volume into respiratory rate. So if you have set the respiratory rate for a baby of 1 kg weight at 50 breaths per minute, we know that the tidal volume in a spontaneously breathing baby, usually we take 5 to 8 ml per kg. So 1 kg baby, 8 ml tidal volume. Minute ventilation is 50 breaths per minute into 8 ml. So 50 into 8 is 400 ml. 5 times of this will be 2000 ml or 2 liters per minute. So the considering that 5 times of minute ventilation for this baby is 2 liters per minute, and we need to give additional 2 to 3 liters for the ventilator circuit losses, the flow that should be set should be at least 4 to 5 liters per minute. Likewise, for a term baby with term baby with respiratory distress with weight of 3 kg, the calculated minute ventilation may come to around 6000 ml or 6 liters per minute. So you may need a flow of 2 to 3 liters more than this, which is at least 8 liters per minute. So when it comes to setting flow, this is called as a bias flow or the base flow, the choice is between 4 to 10 liters per minute. So smaller the baby, the flow should be lesser. The larger the baby, the flow must be more. In some ventilators, we can't change the flow. For example, in SLE 6000, the bias flow is 8 liters per minute, and we really can't change it. Whereas in some other ventilators, like the Draeger ventilator, you can actually alter the flow. So this will reduce rheotrauma or flow-related trauma caused by excessive high flow in a preterm baby.
Ma'am, slideshow is not working.
Again, not working. Let me again stop sharing. Is it working now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So based on what we have discussed, so let us just consider these two statements. PAP is related to the weight of the baby. Is this true? Anybody? You can even answer in the chat box. Excellent. So the PAP has no relation with the weight of the baby or the size of the baby. Rather, it depends upon the severity of the baby. So in other words, you can say compliance of the baby. Lesser the compliance, irrespective of the whether the baby is a 800-gram baby versus a 3 kg baby, if the lung compliance is very, very less, then the PIP required automatically will be more. Whereas very well compliant lung, normal compliant lung, the PIP required will be relatively less, maybe 14, 15, 16, we may be able to achieve good chest rise. So the second statement, larger infants need a higher PIP, that is also false. So PIP requirements, as we discussed, are determined by the compliance of the lung, and these are assessed periodically by looking at PaCO2 in the blood gas and the chest rise as well as the breath sounds. So the primary control for determining the PIP, whenever possible, we should try and use the tidal volume as the guide, and we should try to target 5 ml per kg to be delivered in order to optimize the PIP. So while you have determined, say, you have intubated the baby, connected the baby to ventilator, the baby say you are ventilating the baby for HMD. So you begin with a PEEP of 5 or 6 centimeters, and looking at the recessions, you are titrating the PEEP. FiO2 you have set at 40% based on saturations, targeting 91 to 95%, and other parameters, I time maybe at 0.35 seconds because it's a preterm baby, and rate we have started at say 55 breaths or 60 breaths per minute. The PIP will be decided by the optimal tidal volume that is to be delivered. So you may begin with a PIP initially at around say 17, 18 based on the assessed complaints when we bag the baby. So the stiffer the lung appears to be while bagging the baby, the more will be the initial PIP that you will begin with. Say in a baby with more stiff lungs, difficult to bag, you may begin with PIP of 20, 21, 22. Assess the tidal volume. So we try to achieve a tidal volume of at least 5 ml per kg in a ventilated baby. If the tidal volume delivered is lesser than this, then we'll have to increase the PIP, of course, up to 24 to 25 centimeters, above which we may have to think of high frequency oscillation. And likewise, if the PIP delivered is already high, say 6 or 7 ml per kg, in a ventilated baby, we try to not do overdrive ventilation, and hence we try to keep it at around 5 ml per kg, and we will try to come down on the PIP. So effectively leave the baby on the lowest PIP at which there is adequate ventilation with optimal tidal volume. And choices are between 12 and up to 20 or 25 centimeters of water. The normal complaint lung will need lesser PIP. Poorly complaint lung is going to need higher PIP. FiO2 again is determined by the severity of the lung disease. The choices are between 21 to 100%. The more abnormal the AADO2 or the diffusion gradient, the more higher will be the FiO2 required. So if AADO2 is normal, then we may be able to set 21%. Typically in a baby who is getting ventilated for a non-pulmonary reason like IEM or CNS reason, baby with asphyxia, we may be able to get away with a FiO2 of 21 or 25%. Whereas in a baby with parenchymal pathology requiring ventilation, usually the baby will require slightly higher FiO2. Whereas in very, very severely abnormal parenchyma with PPHM, the baby might require an FiO2 of even close to 100%. Adjust the FiO2 in order to reach the target saturation of 90 to 95%. So to summarize, this is going to be the effect of the various parameters on oxygenation and CO2 elimination. Now FiO2, very simple, direct relationship with the oxygenation. It has absolutely no effect on CO2 elimination. More the FiO2, more will be the PaO2 and SpO2. When it comes to PIP, peak inflation pressure, PIP is going to influence both oxygenation and CO2 elimination. So higher the peak inflation pressure, better will be the mean airway pressure, and hence better will be oxygenation. Also elimination. So you will find that when you change PiO to PIP, so when you increase PIP from say 18 to 20, it will influence both the oxygenation as well as CO2 elimination. It improves oxygenation, it also improves CO2 elimination. Coming to PEEP, PEEP again indirectly influences both. When we increase PEEP, it improves the mean airway pressure much more effectively than PIP does. So the effect of PEEP on mean airway pressure and hence on oxygenation is more than the effect of PIP. So PEEP must be increased whenever we find the baby to be having recessions, increased work of breathing, and increasing FiO2 requirement because it has maximum influence on MAP. But remember that when we increase PEEP without changing the PIP, the delta P is going to become lesser. So when we increase PEEP with the same PIP, the delta P will become narrower, hence CO2 elimination may get compromised and the baby may develop CO2 retention. When it comes to I time, obviously the I time also increases mean airway pressure. So increasing I time also influences MAP, increases MAP and hence improves oxygenation. It also makes CO2 elimination better. However, if we increase I time without any change on the respiratory rate, then we are going to compromise on the E time and hence CO2 elimination can actually become poorer and hence lead to CO2 retention. So increasing I time with the same respiratory rate will lead to shorter E time and hence can lead to air trapping and hence ineffective CO2 elimination. So the CO2 may actually go up. Now increasing respiratory rate, provided the I time is constant, will also improve oxygenation. So increasing respiratory rate with constant I time increases MAP and increases oxygenation. Definitely increasing respiratory rate will lower down the carbon dioxide level or it makes CO2 elimination better. Flow, again, generally by increasing flow, we will be able to achieve higher mean airway pressure because we will be achieving the rise to PIP shorter in a shorter time and hence the oxygenation becomes better. Increasing flow may lead to CO2 retention also because of air trapping. So with all these parameters, the aim is to achieve adequate ventilation, which is defined by or assessed by the presence of a comfortable baby, minimal or absent recessions, adequate chest expansion, absence of cyanosis, good or adequate capillary refill time, and normal hemodynamic status or normal blood pressures, adequate air entry bilaterally when assessed with a stethoscope, and normal saturations, that is 90 to 95% saturations, provided the alarm limits are optimally placed, and a normal ABG. What do we mean by normal ABG? The pH must be in the normal range. 7.35 to 7.45. You may accept up to 7.3 also. PaO2 in a preterm baby 50 to 70, in a term baby 60 to 80 millimeters of mercury. PaCO2 in the normal range, although in a ventilated baby we may accept up to 45 or 50 millimeters of mercury, provided the baby is hemodynamically stable and the pH is more than 7.25. This is per concept of permissive hypercapnia. So presence of all these clinical and blood gas parameters indicates that the baby is getting adequate ventilation. Comfortable, absence of retractions, normal, optimal saturations, optimal blood gas, and optimal hemodynamic status. So I will go on to the modes of ventilation now, and quickly we will run through the three important terminology in order to discuss this. All different modes of ventilation basically are determined by these three different variables: the triggering variable, the limiting variable, and the cycling variable. So what do we mean by the triggering variable? The triggering variable is the variable that causes the breath to begin. So this could be the baby's negative inspiratory pressure generated by the baby's inspiratory effort, or it could be the flow that is generated by the baby's inspiration. Or in some ventilatory modes, it could even be the respiratory movement, which can be assessed by ECG electrodes, or abdominal applanation tonometers, which measure the abdominal movements. So any of these can be used as triggering variables. The next variable is the limiting or the control variable, which means what determines the maximum flow during the ventilator breath. Usually, this is either pressure or volume. All other parameters such as flow are rarely used as limiting variables. So we either use pressure limited ventilation, pressure controlled ventilation, where the pressure that is predetermined by us determines the maximum flow during the ventilator cycle. Or in volume ventilation, we predetermine the tidal volume of the patient. So we say this is the tidal volume desired, and this determines the limit of the breath. The third important variable is the cycling variable, which determines when the ventilator breath moves from inhalation, inspiration to expiration. Commonly, this is time. So most of our ventilator modes like SIMV are time cycled modes of ventilation. So when the I time finishes, the ventilator moves from inspiration to expiration. In some modes like PSV or pressure support ventilation, this could be flow. So we will be discussing a little bit more on these three when we discuss modes of ventilation. Now, the changing of settings, the 6 settings that we discussed, the PI, PP, FiO2, flow, I time, and respiratory rate, it depend upon clinical examination, blood gas parameters, and the expected natural course of the disease, as we discussed. So when we see that on clinical examination, the baby is having increased work of breathing. During spontaneous breathing, the baby is having excessive recessions. This indicates low functional residual capacity. And we are actually ventilating the baby in the lower part of the PV loop, or PV curve, or the PV loop, or in the unfavorable non-compliant part of the PV loop. So this calls for an increase in the PEEP. So if you are giving a PEEP of 5 and the baby is still having persistent recessions, score of 3, 4, consider increasing the PEEP to 6 or maybe 7. Now, clinical examination, if it shows inadequate chest movement on ventilator breaths, then this calls for increase in PI. Or likewise, if you see inadequate tidal volumes. If we see other parameters of increased work of breathing like head bobbing and the baby tiring out and asynchrony, then this indicates that the baby needs increase in the respiratory rate. Likewise, if the baby has wheezing, wheezing is a very rare sign in newborn babies, but if the baby has rhonchi or wheeze, and if there is no post-expiration pause, then it means that there is inadequate time the baby probably has for expiration. So if you don't give adequate E time, the baby can go for yak trapping. So try to optimize the E time. See whether you can reduce the respiratory rate in this baby, because you cannot compromise on the I time as well. So with all these parameters, we try to, at the end of the day, achieve these two goals: achieving adequate oxygenation and adequate CO2 elimination. Oxygenation is expressed by the product of mean airway pressure and FiO2. We all know mean airway pressure is also determined by the product of I time into PIP plus E time into P divided by the respiratory cycle. That is I time plus E time. And MAP is directly proportional to the peak, PIP, I time, and flow. So increasing any of these four parameters improves oxygenation: peak, PIP, I time, and flow. Also the respiratory rate, provided the I time is constant. Now CO2 elimination is determined by the minute ventilation. Minute ventilation is the product of respiratory rate into tidal volume, and tidal volume in ventilated baby is determined by the difference between PIP and P, which is delta P. So I'll stop here. We have discussed the 6 different variables or knobs that we operate during ventilation. And we have discussed how we will decide these settings initially. Which 4 settings can be decided based on the underlying diagnosis, and which 2 settings will be determined based on the severity of the disease. So FiO2 and PIP are going to be determined based on the severity, irrespective of the weight or size of the baby. Whereas P, respiratory rate, I time, and flow generally are determined by the disease and the baby's size, baby's weight. Then we discussed how each of these parameters can be titrated, what are the typical ranges in which these 6 parameters can operate, and what are the problems of using excessively large, when we are operating at the higher end of the range versus the lesser and lower end of the range. So we'll stop here, and we will just take 10 minutes to go bedside with the ventilator.
Now we shall be, I hope I'm audible.
Yes, ma'am.
So now I hope you would be able to see the ventilator in some time, and we can actually demonstrate the knobs and various parameters. Are you able to see the ventilator now?
It's not clear, ma'am.
Is it blurred? I mean, is the screen looking very blurred?
Yes, ma'am, it is blurred.
I'm sorry for the inconvenience. I'm just trying to adjust the settings.
Ma'am, in background effects, you change from blur to none.
Let me just log off and try to log in from a different system and see. One second. Any of So until the settings are being adjusted, so every ventilator, we know that it comes with the following parts. We have the, can you come closer? The gas source, which is a combination of oxygen as well as air. This gas source is blended within the ventilator, and we have series of pressure regulators here with an inbuilt compressor, which will compress or pressurize the gas to a total pressure of 100 psi. The inbuilt blender also helps us to deliver the FiO2 that we desire. Then we have the ventilator interface. We have the patient outlet or inspiratory circuit, which goes to the heated humidifier and then comes out through this green tubing into the patient interface.
Just hold on, I'll do something. I thought this check very well.
This is the expiratory tube here that goes through the water trap and back to the machine. So there is a continuous through the ventilator, which is called as a bias flow or base flow, which for instance, 1000 is fixed at a flow of around 10 liters per minute. Now, when we see how the pressure is actually generated, we know that compressed air source, air and oxygen mix is going into the ventilator, and we have series of pressure regulators here. So, in order to deliver pressure to the patient here, there has to be some degree of obstruction or resistance at the expiratory end. Otherwise, the gas that is flowing in will keep flowing
Ma'am,
from
video
the
is blurred.
Ma'am, in more you need to change background.
It is not visible, ma'am.
Background settings you need to change.
or we'll do like this. We'll probably hold this for this time. Demo next time. We'll try to work on the, the video quality, and we'll try to do this for the next session. So I think we will stop the session as of now for today, or we could alternatively do the PowerPoint on patient triggered ventilation and do the bedside demonstration next week. Shall we move on with the rest of the presentation otherwise and do the live demo the following week?
Ma'am, in the settings, you need to switch off the background effects, ma'am. That is a problem, I guess. The background effects, it's on, I guess, in your phone.
Right, very sorry for that disturbance, and we are trying to see if that can be figured out. So are you able to now continue to, are you able to see the presentation now, the Zoom?
No, ma'am.
One second. Okay, I hope now the slides are moving. Are slides moving, or are they not moving?
No, ma'am.
They are not moving. One second. Now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. We'll see if we can figure out the blur video issue. But in the meantime, I thought we'll continue with the presentation. So while we discuss so much about the different settings, something about patient-triggered ventilation. So we know that in intermittent mandatory ventilation, the ventilator delivers a few mandatory breaths at fixed time intervals, irrespective of the patient's spontaneous efforts. So typically in IMV mode of ventilation, this is how the ventilator breaths are going to look. All these red dotted lines indicate the beginning of the patient's the ventilator breaths. And the patient's breaths are going to look like this, and the red lines indicate the beginning of patient's inspiration, whereas ventilator breaths are randomly superimposed on the patient's breaths. And hence you can appreciate, like in the first triangle, when the patient begins inspiration, the ventilator has not begun inspiration. It is beginning inspiration much later in the beginning of the violet square. So there is asynchrony. Likewise, when the patient begins expiration, the ventilator is still delivering inspiration. So this also results in asynchrony. Only in the third breath, we see that randomly the patient's inspiration and the ventilator's inspiration coincided, and this results in synchrony. So the harms of asynchrony, which is the mismatch or lack of sync between the patient's breaths and the ventilator breaths, this can result in a lot of problems. Both inspiratory asynchrony as well as expiratory asynchrony are a norm in intermittent mandatory ventilation, because we are delivering fixed breaths at fixed time intervals without considering the patient's efforts. And asynchrony can lead to a lot of harms in the form of ineffective ventilation. So it leads to increased work of breathing, hypoxia, and CO2 retention. It may also lead to inadvertent PEEP or air trapping because of the gas getting trapped. The ventilator begins the next breath inspiration even before the patient has completed expiration. So this results in air trapping and auto PEEP. It can also increase the risk of air leaks such as pulmonary interstitial emphysema or pneumothorax. Because of air trapping and increased emphysematous changes within the lung, there can be interference in the cerebral blood flow, leading to increased risk of intraventricular hemorrhage. And hence, one also always tries to improve the strategies to overcome asynchrony. Now, this can be done while you are still in IMV. We can try to improve asynchrony by either increasing the rate. So this is an attempt to capture the newborn's breaths. But we know that increasing the respiratory rate on ventilator comes with some problems, such as the cutting down, compromising of E time, leading to inadvertent PEEP or auto PEEP generation, and increased chances of lung injury. Likewise, it may result in increased, we may do increase, try to increase the peak inflation pressure and try to achieve that synchrony. But this is going to result in, again, lung injury due to barotrauma and volutrauma and air leaks. And finally, we often resort in sedation and paralysis. This also comes with side effects like hypotension and respiratory depression. And hence, the role of patient-triggered ventilation, which is very, very important. So we have different modes of patient-triggered ventilation. I think the video part of the ventilator has improved, and hence I think we will go to the bedside and finish 10 minutes of bedside discussion, and we can discuss patient-triggered modes in detail in the upcoming Friday session. So I'll stop the presentation here.
Let me go back. Let me do it. This is the video, okay? Just click on it. They are seeing this.
So this is now host. I can speak now. So I hope now the video is clear, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am.
Let me just go. So the heart of the ventilator comprises of the gas or the gas source. Then we have the actual patient, the ventilator's interface. We have the inspiratory mean tubing and the expiratory tubing, and the patient interface, which is the endotracheal. So let's go part by part. So we all know oxygen as well as air tubing go into the ventilators. All ventilators have their own mechanism to compress or pressurize this gas source so that we deliver the gases at a pressure of 100 psi. They have inbuilt blender, which results in the delivery of the fractional inspired concentration that is desired or set by us. It also has pressure sensing mechanisms, which we are trying to measure using the pressure transducer that we connect here. And finally, it also comes with the flow sensor, which is also an integral part of the ventilator. So the blended mixed gas, air and oxygen mix, which is compressed and pressurized, now flows at a constant flow rate to the inspiratory tubing. The inspiratory tubing that leads to the heater humidifier apparatus, and from here through the green tubing, it comes back to the patient interface. You have the flow sensor and the pressure transducer connected here. These are mandatory parts of the circuit. Of course, we can work without the flow sensor. So this is the flow sensor, but the pressure transducer is mandatory. And here we have the expiratory tubing here going back to the ventilator. So the expiratory tubing does not have the heater wire, and hence it always comes with a water trap. We have now the newer dual heater wire circuits which do away without the water trap even in the expiratory. So through this inspiratory and expiratory tubing, there is always a constant flow of gas which is fixed as per the ventilator make. So for this SLE 6000 ventilator, there is a bias flow of gas which we cannot change. Whereas in a Draeger ventilator or baby log ventilator, we can actually change the flow based on the baby's weight or baby size, like we discussed, 5 times fluid ventilation plus 2. But here it's going to be a fixed flow. So this flow is going to flow through the inspiratory and across the patient interface and back via the expiratory tubing back to the ventilator. Now, how does the ventilator then deliver the pressure or gas flow to the patient? This mandates the presence of obstruction or resistance in the expiratory tubing. So once there is obstruction caused by either an expiratory valve, which can be a physical valve, or it can be a solenoid valve, which is like an electromagnetic valve, or it could be in the form of a diaphragm, like we see in the Sensormedics ventilator. So there are multiple mechanisms for creating this resistance. But whatever be the mechanism, only when there is a resistance, some pressure would be delivered to the patient, because depending upon the resistance offered, gas would flow to the patient. So typically, for delivering P, which is typically a lower number than PIP, the resistance offered will be partial. If the resistance offered is more complete, then more gas will be pushed towards the patient, which results in delivering PIP. Now, for how long the valve here is partially occluded versus completely occluded is determined by us setting the E time and the I time. So for the I time, the ventilator will be actually delivering higher pressure or PIP. So it is more completely occluded. For E time, the ventilator, the expiratory valve is partially occluded and hence it delivers P to the patient. So what are the different types of valve? So the common types of valve are the typical, the physical expiratory valve, which is similar to what we see in a Draeger ventilator. You could have a solenoid valve, as you see in an Accutronics ventilator. So Accutronics ventilator typically has a solenoid valve. Some ventilators come with a diaphragm, which can oscillate to and fro, like we see in the Sensormedics ventilator. There can be in SLE 6000 and SLE 5000, you can have a different mechanism of producing resistance, which is something called as a reverse flow, inverse flow. So here what happens is, instead of having a physical valve here, the ventilator actually gives a reverse flow from the expiratory side towards the patient. So this flow itself acts as a resistance producing mechanism for generating pressure at the patient interface. And hence, SLE ventilator always comes with something called as a restrictor in order to prevent this reverse flow from reaching the patient. So whenever we use the SLE circuit, it is important that we use the restrictor, because reverse flow or inverse flow is a mechanism of resistance in SLE. So there are 4 different types of mechanisms to create resistance at the expiratory circuit. These involve a physical valve versus an electromagnetic or a solenoid valve, a diaphragm as seen in HFO, and a reverse flow mechanism seen in SLA. Now, when we have a diaphragm, the important difference in comparison to the other valves is because it moves to even expiration becomes active. Whereas in most conventional modes of ventilation, expiration is a passive process promoted by the elastic recoil of the patient's lungs and the intercostal muscles. So only in diaphragm, the diaphragm moves towards as well as away from the patient. Thereby, it sucks gas out of the lungs during expiration, and hence expiration also becomes a process. So coming to the parts of the circuit, we know that this is the first part of the inspiratory circuit, which goes to the heater humidifier circuit. This is a servo controlled heater humidifier mechanism here. So you can see that this is the heater humidifier chamber, and this is the heater base. So when typically it is on, this plate will be very hot. And with the metal conducting surface, the humidifier chamber is placed. This needs to be filled with water until the black line, which is indicated here. And if you see the humidifier chamber, it has multiple slots, which increase the surface area of contact of the gas with the heated water or water vapor that is present here. So by the time the humidifier exits the heated humidifier chamber, the gases are typically at a temperature of 37 degrees and 100% relative humidity. So this is the proximal heater wire sensor, and this gives feedback through these 2 heater wire adapters. So you have the yellow adapter here. So each of these come with their own slots, and this is the blue color heater wire adapter. Right? So these are the 2 heater wire adapters. This is the proximal heat sensor, and we have a distal sensor here at the point where the heater wire finishes actually. So the heater wire is present through this proximal part of the inspiratory circuit, and you have a proximal as well as a distal heater wire adapter. So why do we have temperature measured at 2 points? This is because when the gases exit from the heater humidifier chamber, they exit at 37 degrees and 100% relative humidity. But because during the transit, when they move in the room temperature, they can actually technically lose temperature. To prevent this, and also to ensure ongoing heating of the gas to an additional 1 to 2 degrees Celsius higher temperature, the heater wire is present. So that in the distal part of the inspiratory circuit, even if there is no heater wire and there is a drop in temperature, still the patient will get the ventilatory gases at the body temperature, which is 37 degrees. That's why there is a heater wire present here. So for maintaining ongoing heating and to heat the gases to an additional 1 to 2 degrees Celsius additional temperature, this is present. So that even if there is a drop in temperature in the part, the patient will still get the gases at 37 degrees and at 100% relative humidity. Now, while coming back, of course, there is no heater wire, and hence there will be automatically some condensation. In order to remove this condensation, we have the water trap. The water trap is to be periodically empty. Now, disconnecting the water trap will not result in disconnection of the circuit. And if heating and humidification goes appropriately, then we may have to autofill the heater humidifier chamber at least 20 times in the day. So the parameters that ensure that the humidification are optimal include that, of course, the baby is comfortable and baby is not having asynchrony. And when you look at the inspiratory tubing, there should be no humidification. When we look at the expiratory tubing, generally there will be some humidification because the gas which is leaving from the patient is at 37 degrees and 100% RH, relative humidity, but it comes in contact with the room temperature, which is at typical NICU temperature of 25-26 degrees Celsius with lesser relative humidity. So there has to be condensation in the expiratory tubing. Now, what are the reasons when you see condensation in the inspiratory tubing? It is always abnormal. This generally means that the heater wire is dysfunctional. It may also mean that this distal heater wire adapter we may have placed under the baby's warmer, and hence this can result in feedback inhibition of the heater wire. So if you see water droplets in the inspiratory tubing, recheck the heater wire, ask the company to come and replace the inspiratory tubings, or make sure that the heater wire adapter, the distal one, is placed outside the baby's heated micro environment like incubator or warmer. Likewise, if we don't see condensation in expiratory tubing, also is a problem. And this generally happens when there is no water at all in the humidifier chamber. So there was no water vapor that was picked up, and we were just giving dry and hot gases to the baby, which is also very wrong. The baby can have a lot of desiccation of the respiratory mucosa. So if we don't see any condensation here, it either means that we did not fill adequate water in the humidifier chamber here, or it might mean that the ambient temperature of the NICU could be very high. So these are the two reasons that this could happen. So this is about the circuit. Always one should use neonatal circuit as much as possible. And here comes the flow sensor. So whenever we remove the flow sensor, the ventilator will generally ask us whether it is okay to continue without the flow sensor. So in SLE 6000, we will see this type of flow sensor, which is a hot wire anemometer. You can see that there are small electrical filaments here, small filaments of metal. These filaments detect the drop in temperature when gas flows across the flow sensor, and this is the mechanism of measuring the flow across the flow sensor. So this works on the principle called as hot wire anemometer. The other type of flow sensor is the pneumotachometer, which is available in some other ventilators, such as the Stefani Sophie ventilator. This other type of flow sensor works on the principle of measuring the pressure differential across the ends of the flow sensor, and there is a predetermined radius and length of tubing that is present within. So when you know the pressure differential and the resistance, you can calculate the flow automatically. Whereas this is a hot wire anemometer. It measures the flow by detecting the drop in temperature of the heated electrical filaments that are present in the flow sensor. Very, very sensitive. And the scan falsely detect humidification, condensation present within the flow sensor, also as false triggering or auto triggering. And this may happen when we are not adequately removing condensate from the tubing. This can go and clog the flow sensor, and this can also be sensed as auto triggering. So whenever we connect the flow sensor to the ventilator tubing, so we will be asked to calibrate the flow sensor. So whenever we start calibration, ensure that the ends of the flow sensor are occluded. So then the ventilator signals that calibration is completed. Only then connect the flow sensor to the circuit. Likewise, it is also important to calibrate oxygen. The SLE asks for oxygen calibration. So this ensures that the oxygen cell, which senses the delivered oxygen, is also calibrated from time to time. This takes almost 4 minutes. You can start it and leave it on so that we get an accurate measurement of the FiO2 that we are delivering to the patient. So on the left side of the screen, we see the choice of different modes. We have just discussed about the differences between CMV or conventional mandatory ventilation versus SIMV, which is a type of patient-triggered mode of ventilation. In the next session, we'll be discussing the different types of PTV, which are broadly categorized under SIMV, synchronized intermittent mandatory ventilation. PTV in SLE refers to assist control ventilation. It is also called as SIPPV in dragger ventilators. It is synchronized intermittent positive pressure ventilation or assist control AC. In SLE, it goes by the name PTV itself. So PTV is a broad term that refers to SIMV, PTV, and PSV. But in SLE, assist control is itself labeled as PTV. And pressure support ventilation, of course, is the flow cycle mode of ventilation. This also we'll discuss in the subsequent class. Of course, we have the HFO mode that is available in SLE ventilator.
Just
So
hold it.
Let's just take SIMV for the sake of understanding the different knobs. So when you choose SIMV, automatically we will be asked to choose these parameters here. So we have PIP. So we discussed how we choose the PIP based on the underlying disease severity or based on the assessed complaints of the patient. You will get an idea while you're bagging the baby. And if you have a pressure manometer, you can actually connect the bag to the pressure manometer to understand what is the PIP required. PEEP, of course, again, depends upon the FRC or functional residual capacity of the patient. And clinically, adequacy is assessed by the retractions and oxygenation. Then we have the I time. Again, we discussed this is short I time in low compliance conditions like HMD, long I time in increased resistance conditions like MAS. Respiratory rate option is available with SLE. So we choose RR and I time in SLE. Automatically E time is decided and hence IE ratio is also decided. This is FiO2. This can be set anything between 21 to 100%. And this is titrated based on the saturations. Now, with any of these modes, we have the option of adding volume targeted ventilation. In SLE, it goes by the name BTV. Again, volume targeted modes, we will discuss the presentation in the upcoming Friday seminar. So it goes by different names based on the ventilator's algorithm. In Draeger, it goes by the name volume guarantee. It goes by the name PRVC in Mackay Siemens ventilator. BIP Bird ventilator has a different kind of volume targeted ventilation. So we have different types of volume targeted modes of ventilation. So in SLE 6000, VTV is the name given. And if you want to choose VTV, you will have to do long press and, select the tidal volume target, which can be anything between 4 to 6 ml per kg. So if you're dealing with, say, a 3 kg baby and you want to keep the tidal volume at 4 ml, then we leave it at 4 ml per kg, we leave it at 12 ml. And in all these modes, we will also be getting the delivered parameters here on the right side, like the delivered respiratory rate. Of course, now the baby is not breathing. So the delivered FiO2, I time, PIP, etc. There are some additional parameters which will vary based on the mode that we choose. So if you choose the pressure support mode of ventilation, then automatically one has to choose, you can see that the PIP has become PIP max because we have chosen the volume target mode of ventilation. And when we go to PSV here, like we have chosen now, so it is asking us to set the termination sensitivity as well as the, the rise time obviously will determine the type of waveform, square wave versus sine wave. So all these other additional So now we calibrated the flow sensor. So now we can take more sensitive versus less sensitive numbers. So basically, this is the least possible flow that will be sensed as the patient's inspiratory breath. So if we choose 0.2 liters per minute, you can see that the unit is liters per minute because we have its flow. So if you want to keep it very sensitive trigger, that is, if you want to detect every small breath of the baby, then you keep it at the least possible trigger, which in SLE is 0.2 liters per minute. This is the least flow trigger that we can set. Of course, if we want to make it more insensitive, or if you want the baby to work harder in order to be sensed as a patient's breath, you can increase this trigger sensitivity to more and more. But this is generally not preferred because the purpose of ventilation itself is to keep the baby's work of breathing the least and is to support as many patient breaths as possible. If you want to add pressure support to SIMV, then over and above whatever set breaths that you have set, the additional breaths of the baby will be supported by pressure support. So that is an optional thing. You can long press in order to choose it. So if the patient breathes at anything more than 30 breaths per minute, the additional breaths will be supported with a pressure support of 8 centimeters, whereas routine breaths will be supported with PIP of 17. So this you can again increase or decrease based on the requirement. Now, whenever we choose pressure support, you can see automatically termination sensitivity is coming up. So this we will discuss in the next session detail when we discuss PSV. So I'll stop here. Again, pulmonary graphics, we will discuss one more time in detail, the pressure time, flow time, and the volume time scalars. So I think I'll stop here, and a couple of questions if we can take, you all have the time. So if there are no questions, I think we will wind up this today's, this was a very, preliminary and slightly unplanned first webinar. I think from the subsequent webinars, we will kind of take up all these technical considerations and try to make it better. Thank you all for joining. Next Friday, we will try to discuss different modes of patient-triggered ventilation. Again, it will be followed by the demonstration. Thank you so much.
Hey, you ask that. You can ask.